Is this some kind of joke? The young officer scoffed, stepping out of her patrol car, mirrored sunglasses glinting in the afternoon sun. Her hand hovered near her holstered weapon. The man she was addressing didn't move. James Harris, 82 years old, sat steady on his rusted-out Harley-Davidson, hands resting calmly on the handlebars. He didn't flinch, didn't speak, just stared out at the horizon as if he had all the time in the world. Her partner stepped out, smirking. "License and registration. Now off the bike, sir." The street was quiet, but tension hung thick in the air. Drivers slowed, curious. A few pedestrians began pulling out their phones. The officers exchanged looks. "Is he deaf?" one whispered. "Or just stubborn?" The young woman grew sharper. "Sir, I said, off the motorcycle." Harris didn't blink. That old engine beneath him rumbled like a distant storm, and the leather of his wallet creaked as he handed over his documents, slowly, deliberately. 82? She said, reading the license. "You think it's safe to be out here at your age?" What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in just a few minutes, the sound of dozens of military engines would roar into that quiet town. 50 soldiers, armed and disciplined, were on their way. And they weren't coming for trouble. They were coming for him, for James Harris, the man they were trying to humiliate in front of a crowd. They had stopped the wrong bike. Every morning for the past 40 years, James Harris has woken at 5. No alarm clock, just discipline, ingrained in his bones. He lives alone, on a modest farm 10 miles outside town, surrounded by pasture and silence. No TV, no internet, just tools, cows, and the open sky. He spends his days working on machines, tractors, plows, and that old 1970 Harley-Davidson that he rides into town once a week. He knows the feel of every bolt, every gear. When his John Deere broke down the day before, he knew the problem without looking. It was the hydraulic system. That's what 42 years of fixing engines teaches a man. His garage is a shrine to grit, a place where rust is not decay, but experience. The Harley doesn't look like much. Paint's faded, frames chipped, but it starts on the first kick and the engine growls like a war drum. He doesn't ride for fun. He rides because it's who he is. A soldier doesn't forget his habits, even after retirement. Harris served in Vietnam, in the Gulf and beyond, though you wouldn't know it to look at him. No medals on the wall, no stories unless you asked. He's never once raised his voice in town, never asked for a discount, never told anyone who he really was. To most, he's just an old man on a loud bike. But inside him lives a lifetime of command, combat, and sacrifice. He once trained entire platoons. He once made decisions that saved lives. And now all they saw was gray hair and a leather vest. Life has a cruel way of forgetting its heroes. But James Harris hadn't forgotten who he was. And soon neither would they. Back on the street, the confrontation grew more uncomfortable. Officer Ava Johnson looked over the license again. 82, she muttered, then louder. "You're a little old to be riding a motorcycle, don't you think?" Her partner, Officer Lopez, laughed. "This Harley's older than my dad. Look at all that rust." Harris said nothing. He kept his eyes forward, hands still. Johnson stepped closer, hands on the bike, feet apart. They began to search him in the vehicle. There was no probable cause. They both knew it, but that didn't stop them. People were watching now, recording with their phones. Some muttered, "Poor guy." Others whispered, "Maybe he's confused." One woman said, "That's someone's grandpa." Johnson leaned in again. "Do you live nearby?" Harris nodded. "Farm, off Highway 340. "Alone?" "Always have," Lopez smirked. "No family? No one to check on you?" Johnson stepped back, hands on her hips. "You're not making this easy," Mr. Harris simply clasped his hands behind his back. "I'm listening." "Then answer me. Don't you think it's dangerous to ride at your age? Your reflexes, your eyesight?" Lopez leaned in, whispering again. "He's probably deaf too." Johnson raised her voice. "Mr. Harris, can you hear me?" Still, Harris remained calm. Inside, he was used to this, used to being underestimated. He'd stood on hostile soil, facing weapons far more dangerous than suspicion and pride. But that was long ago. Now he was being judged not for what he'd done, but for how he looked. Johnson stepped forward. "We're taking you in for a psychiatric evaluation." Harris looked at her slowly as if measuring her soul. "Based on what law?" She froze. She didn't know, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. Across the street, inside a small gas station, Marcus Williams had been watching. He stopped wiping the fuel pump when he saw what was happening. Marcus was 58 years old, a Gulf War vet himself. He recognized Harris immediately. The old man had been filling up at his station for over a decade. Always polite, always exact with his change, always steady. Marcus felt his stomach twist. This wasn't right. Not for a man like Harris, not for someone who'd earned the right to be left in peace. He picked up the phone and dialed the base at Fort Carson. "Yes, this is Marcus Williams. I need to speak with an officer. Urgent." The person on the other end asked what the emergency was. "There's a veteran being harassed by local police. Name's James Harris, 82. I've known him for 15 years. There was a pause, then a different voice came on the line. "Did you say James Harris?" "Yes." "Stay there. Do not let them touch him. Help is coming." Marcus hung up, chest tight, hands shaking. He stepped closer to the road. Something was coming, something big, and he wasn't going to let them lay another finger on Colonel James Harris. Officer Johnson had now fully committed to her authority. "Mr. Harris, I'm ordering you to come with us." Harris stood still, calm, unafraid. "I'm not going." "This isn't a request," she snapped. "It's for your own safety." "Based on what?" "Elder protection law." "Show me the statute." She hesitated. She didn't have one. But her pride was on the line, and so was her control. The cameras were rolling now. People on the sidewalk were beginning to speak up. "This is wrong. He's done nothing. Just an old man, leave him be." Johnson's jaw clenched. Last chance. That's when Harris smiled. Just slightly. That kind of smile that only comes from recognizing a well-dressed lie. "Officer," he said, "how long have you been on the job?" 3 years. "And in that time, how many people have you arrested just for growing old?" Before she could answer, the ground began to tremble. Not from her authority, but from engines. Big ones. Down the road, a convoy approached fast. Dust kicked up. Lights on. Humvees. Plural. The crowd turned, heads swiveled, cameras pointed. Harris didn't turn around. He just closed his eyes and whispered, "Right on time." The rumble grew louder. No one knew what was coming, except him. 12 Humvees came roaring down the main road, engines snarling like beasts. They moved in unison, tight, precise, unstoppable. They didn't slow until they reached the gas station, forming a half-moon around the scene. Doors flung open. 50 soldiers stepped out, boots hitting pavement in synchronized rhythm. They formed ranks. In the center Humvee, the door opened, and a tall, sharp-eyed officer stepped out. Captain George Farrell. 55. 22 years in service. 3 tours. He walked straight toward the commotion without a glance at the local officers. He stopped 3 meters from Harris, brought his hand to his brow, and snapped a perfect salute. "Colonel Harris." Silence fell like a hammer. The word colonel echoed like thunder. Johnson blinked. Lopez stepped back. "Colonel?" Farrell turned slowly. "Who stopped Colonel Harris?" We didn't know he was military," Johnson stammered. Farrell's voice turned to steel. "This man served 3 tours in Vietnam, trained U.S. intelligence in the Gulf and Afghanistan. He personally trained hundreds of officers, including me. This man holds 2 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Distinguished Service Cross. And you stopped him. You searched him. You humiliated him." Behind him, the 50 soldiers took one synchronized step forward, a silent show of force. Farrell looked Johnson in the eye. "You disrespected a living legend." She swallowed hard. I was doing my job. Your job is to protect and serve, not to judge and shame." The crowd was silent. Then, as if on cue, the phones lifted again. But now they weren't recording a humiliation. They were recording history. Captain Farrell turned to Harris. "Colonel, do you need anything from us? Escort? Transport?" Harris shook his head. I think the message was loud enough. Farrell nodded. We'll always be here. Always. He turned to the officers. You don't understand the weight of what you did, not because of who he is, but because of how you treated someone without knowing. Johnson stepped forward, head bowed. Sir, I'm sorry. Harris looked at her, not with anger, the patience of a man who had trained teenagers to become warriors. May I offer you some advice? Yes, sir. Never judge someone by what they look like. You have no idea what battles they've fought or what scars they carry. The words sank deep, not just for her, but for everyone watching. In a moment of silence, the moral clarity of the situation was laid bare. Respect isn't something you give to uniforms alone. It's something you give to humanity. And today, a lot of people had learned that lesson the hard way. A week later, the sheriff's department received a formal call from Fort Carson, not to press charges, not to demand resignations, but to offer a solution. We'd like to train your officers, Farrell said. Show them what it really means to serve. Sheriff Smith agreed immediately. The training began that same month. Officer Ava Johnson stood before her colleagues and said, Last week, I made a mistake. I disrespected a man who deserved only honor. I judged too fast. I didn't listen. But I've learned something more important than policy. She looked around the room. Every person we stop carries a story, especially the elderly. We must ask before we assume, listen before we label, and above all, respect before we react. Days later, Ava Johnson drove down Highway 340. Her hands were sweating. Her heart pounded. She pulled up to a quiet farm. White house, porch swing, freshly mowed grass, a John Deere parked under the sun. Under the tractor, in a grease-stained jumpsuit, was James Harris. She approached. Colonel Harris? He slid out, wiping his hands. Officer Johnson. Sir, I wanted to talk, if that's okay. Coffee's on. Come in. In the kitchen, over 2 blue ceramic mugs, he asked, Why'd you become a cop? She paused. To help people. He nodded. Then remember, help starts with listening. She smiled faintly, looked out the window. That rusty Harley sat under a tree. Still loud, still alive, still free. And so was he. So are we all if we're given the road.